Much, Devyani. Welcome, everyone. Really appreciate you all taking the time to watch this Sophos Insight webinar that we have today. And the topic that we're going to be discussing, as Devyani noted, is strengthening security, controlling costs, the power of prevention. So we're going to be covering a topic that, in my opinion, isn't talked about enough. Really, the emphasis on preventative controls in cybersecurity. And in particular, we're going to be talking about the economic impact of having really strong prevention. So there's two elements that I think have kind of gotten lost in recent conversations, and we'll get into that a little bit more in a bit. I'm very excited to be joined by a really great expert on this topic, Ross McKercher. He's CISO at Sophos. Ross, why don't you introduce yourself to the group here today?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So yeah, my name's Ross McKercher. I'm the CISO at Sophos. I've been here at Sophos for 18 years. So I think that's 2 life sentences basically. And as well as my my day jobs protecting Sophos. As you can imagine, the CISO of a security company I get my fingers in all sorts of things here. One of my recent new responsibilities is I spend a lot of time with the threat intelligence teams and helping them communicate some of our threat intel insights externally.
Excellent. Yeah. So Ross is responsible for the security of a security company, and you've been here for 18 years. Remind me, Ross, what's the normal timeline of a CISO in a lot of roles? Sometimes you have to be an outlier in terms of tenure in the position.
It tends to correlate with average time to breach, I find. So.
And the reason we wanted to have Ross on today, we're going to be kind of looking at Sophos as kind of an example use case. So we're going to be talking a little bit about how we do things, and from a prevention standpoint, also how we correlate that with the work that we do on the security operations side of our business. So Ross is really the perfect person to be leading this discussion here today. I'm just here to help him. My name is Eric Kokonis. I'm our VP of Product Marketing and Market Intelligence here at Sophos. In terms of this conversation, the most relevant part of what I get to do is work really closely with the analyst research community. So, the Gartners and IDCs and Frost & Sullivan, Omdia, and the list goes on. And this is a topic that even they will say doesn't get enough attention, really thinking about prevention. And that kind of leads me into the first question that I have for you, Ross, here today, which is, it does seem like endpoint protection, or preventative security controls has taken a back seat over the past number of years to detection and response technologies. Prevention is you kind of hear it as, well, it's a commodity and everyone kind of has it. And it's all more or less the same, isn't it? And obviously that's a fallacy, but why do you think that notion exists? Why do you think people are spending less time thinking about prevention and protection than maybe they used to?
Yeah, I think it's actually a bit of a function of what's easy to measure. So, there's some very common metrics in the industry, kind of mean time to response, mean time to detection. Detections create tickets in queues, and when you have tickets in queues, you can measure how quickly they change status and get resolved. But sometimes we miss the wider picture, which is the less tickets that hit the queue, the less time that we have to do a detailed and heavy lift on the response side, that's effort avoided entirely. But it's kind of one of those trees falling in the forest problem. If it never happened, then how do you measure it?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and maybe even worth. One of the things that we find with our webinars is we have people who attend who are battle tested, incredibly talented operators who are notching wins all the time against nation state attackers. And then we also have people who attend our webinars who aren't as close to the day-to-day operations of cybersecurity. It's something that they know that they need to be thinking about to manage their business, but maybe they're not in the fight every single day. So maybe just to make sure that we're addressing the audience, maybe give us a definition of what when we talk about prevention and protection, what does that mean relative to detection and response tooling or operations work?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're talking about detection, it's usually about an analyst investigation. So there'll be an alert, and whether that's automated or via triage process, there'll be a determination that the attacker got far enough into the environment that you need to ask the question, what did they do and what are they going to do from now on? Because when you've detected something, that's literally all you've done. There's no there's no positive impact to detection unless a human comes in and resolves that incident. So that's detection, and it's very commonly measured just because of the, as I said before, the time required to spend on it. You're in a console, you're investigating, you're pivoting on indicators. It can be a pretty serious lift. Prevention is, and there's kind of gray here, obviously, but prevention is typically where a fully automated control has kicked in and hit an attack early enough in its life cycle that you're in a confident position. You may still want to come in and investigate because it may still be far enough in your environment that you have concerns around how it got that far. It depends. So, for example, one that if you get a detection on your domain controller or some sensitive environment, you're not just going to pause there and say, if it's been prevented, you're not just going to pause there and say, okay, our job is done. But you're still on the front foot because you've broken that kill chain. The attacker at that very point in time is sitting there and saying, "Oh, okay, what am I going to do next? That didn't work." They're regrouping. So that's prevention. Prevention in a nutshell.
Yeah, so to use a way too overplayed analogy of this would be like if someone was trying to rob a bank and they got into the bank and they got to the vault door and the vault door was locked and they couldn't get in. So you've blocked that threat, you've prevented that robbery, but you still have a robber who's in the bank and maybe something needs to happen about that next. Is that a very dumb analogy, but that's
fair. So we're not saying that any incident that you fully prevent or protect against means that you haven't to do any investigation, but it's just that the playing field's already tilted in your advantage. You're already winning at that point. And then that's of course not to mention, to use a bank analogy, there's also the locked door on the front of the bank. You're obviously not going to initiate a full scale response when every chance to come by and just checks whether the door's locked or not. So there are also a whole set of events that if you prevent outright, it's just you don't do much more. Someone comes knocking, and if the door doesn't, if the door's not open, you can probably just move on with your day.
I really appreciate you, Ross, indulging my analogy. I'm sure that was painful for you, but I appreciate you making.
What's the car analogy? It's a little bit different. It's it's usually about cars and driving, isn't it? The classic IT analogy.
Yeah. What are some of the examples tactically where prevention might need to be augmented with detection and response? Can you mention certain things that attackers do might require a bit of both and there's a bit of interplay? So maybe describe those types of scenarios. What are the things that prevention can really take care of everything without any human intervention? And what are those scenarios where you do need that subsequent investigation and response work?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the micro attack stages, for example, or think of if you think of an attack as a series of actions and objectives, the simple rule is the earlier in that attack life cycle that you manage to prevent, the less you have to worry about what happened and running a full investigation. So the extreme examples of that are, if some malware is blocked outright, even at the domain stage, so you don't even get you visit a malicious web page, you don't even get to see the malicious web page. That happens thousands, millions of times a day potentially. And actually, you kind of get this pyramid basically. You get these very kind of high volume simple blocks, or your firewall blocking a packet, I guess you could argue, is the extreme example of prevention. And then as you go up that stack, so the next one would be, maybe a bit of malware got blocked before it was ran on your machine, but it actually hit your machine. Now, depending upon your risk tolerance, you might still go, oh, so someone downloaded a bit of malware. How did it get there? But a lot of orgs, it depends on how much they're willing to resource this. They might then go, well, that's probably fine. And then the other extreme example, like the one I used previously, was if you've got an internal asset in your systems that's very high value. So, attackers will commonly go for things like domain controllers. If you have a execution on that, even if it's prevented, then you're still going to want to run some kind of investigation off the back of that to figure out what happened, either directly or working with your MDR provider.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, yeah, there's clearly interplay between the prevention up front left, and we'll talk about kind of the notion of shift left here in a bit, and then the reduction of downstream workload, which is where your investigation and triage work and ultimately response and remediation efforts would occur. So naturally then, to get back to the economic piece of this, which is again sometimes not emphasized enough in conversations about preventative controls, how do you measure whether that prevention is truly effective in reducing that downstream workload? I mean, it is difficult. You're trying to measure the value of something not happening. This is the kind of classic challenge in ROI and cybersecurity. But kind of help us understand how would you know? And if you're running a security program, how would you know whether or not your prevention is doing an adequate job, or if you're doing an inordinate amount of time, spending an inordinate amount of time on the detection, investigation, response pieces?
Yeah. I mean, it's all about how you have to make some assumptions. Like you can't tell how far an attack would go down your stack, but you can make reasonable assumptions, and you often don't have to kind of over-egg this to get to some very, very compelling use cases. So, let's take the domain blocks, for example. If you can measure how many domain blocks you're seeing across your organization, and let's say you don't have that layer in your products, you can make a reasonable judgment, maybe based on the results of your phishing assessments, for example, of what percentage of those domain blocks. So let's say you're at 2-3% click rate in your phishing assessments. Then that gives you kind of, you could assume that if you had no technical controls, that like 2 or 3% of the domains that were hitting users in email were getting, we're getting clicked on. And then you might find that you have, of that 2 or 3% click, actually, to be honest, most orgs, it's a fair bit higher, would be my guess. But let's say that half of those are, inputting their credentials potentially. And then you've got a simple thing you can measure. Speak to your IT help desk, and what's your cred reset time? How quickly does that take? So even if you assume that at that point they get caught and you do a credential, you've immediately got a cost. You've got something that you can quantify, and that alone might be compelling enough. But if you want to strengthen the kind of business case for building out those early stage controls, you take it a step further. Let's assume that your help desk might not be 24/7, 365. So let's assume that I don't know, a third of the time, a quarter of the time, that those credential rotations take a long time. So then you've got an attacker potentially with an authenticated attacker in your environment, and that's where the costs start to really go up. And again, you don't have to take a massive leap of imagination to imagine that an attacker in your environment with credentials for a few hours could have gone to all sorts of places, and you're into quite deep investigations there. So you can assume a forensic. You'd at least want to review if it's Microsoft, the O365 logs to see what files they accessed, or if they're in your network, you're into kind of basically into full hunting response, and conservatively, you can estimate a few days per incident on that, and that's a conservative estimate. And all of a sudden, you've clearly found yourself in a position where even what sound like relatively small things can get very expensive very, very quickly.
Yeah, very good. All right, so that's helpful context, Ross. So the next topic that we have is kind of dovetails with what we just discussed, is that role of prevention in maximizing security operations center efficiency and ROI. So if you have prevention on one side and you've got detection and response, security operations work on the other side, if you have weaker protection, you might going to see more detections, more cases, more investigation workload for analysts on the other side of things. This is one of the things that we do see in sometimes in third-party tests, where there could be kind of an overemphasis on the number of detections generated, and people will sometimes think well, look how many detections this tool generated. Well, that might be good. It might also be evidence of poor prevention.
Yeah, I mean, it's got funny story about our MITRE evaluation a couple of years back when we start participating in the MITRE tests. because Sophos has always had a strong, protection layer, strong prevention in its products, we were actually killing attacks too early, and we weren't producing the signal for the MITRE evaluation. So we're actually turning off capabilities in our products so that we can hit some of the MITRE criteria. It's a concept that is kind of dear to us because we've been doing it for so long, and sometimes I don't think it's given the credit it's worth. I mean, let's take the kind of, you can call it the dumbest thing, which is like atomic IOC. By atomic IOC, I mean IP addresses or domains or hashes. They're sometimes kind of dismissed because they're so brittle. They change really, really regularly. And that's a very valid criticism. And it really stems from the days when people were kind of taking threat intelligence feeds that would be like a list of hashes, and then manually loading them into their SIM or their firewall or wherever. I mean, that honestly, that approach never really worked. But it's complete insanity nowadays because stuff kind of changes so quick. But it doesn't mean there's not a ton of value in blocking those. You just need to do it in a fashion that is extremely automated and extremely quick. So we have these, we have, for instance, in our cloud database in FXL, we have these huge distributed low latency databases, which are full of these atomic IOCs, but we're updating them continuously, and the products are referring to them continuously. So it's actually a lot of kind of, secret sauce and magic in maintaining that globally available low latency list of all these atomic IOCs and blocking stuff at the door. And if you run the numbers and you look at the number of just the sheer volume of, frankly, mainly junk, right? Most of it is not, we're not claiming that these aren't bypassable control measures. But if you just look at the cold hard stats of, the 90+% of attacks that are blocked at that very early layer, not only are you saving any effort for manual effort as well, it has performance benefits as well, because you're not having to scan for behavioral detections or use everyone knows that AI is expensive, right? So you don't want your ML engine having a look at something when you already know just with a simple checksum lookup that it's malicious. So there's a ton of value in just lopping something's head off really, really, really early in that attack chain.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Ross. And so a couple things. So you mentioned the MITRE attack evaluations for enterprise products. I wanted to kind of just name those. Those are an independent testing group that conducts these annual evaluations where they're looking at prevention and detection and response capabilities. Sophos is a participant. Most of the leading vendors in cybersecurity participate in those evaluations. So if you're interested, go to the MITRE attack website, click on the various rounds of evaluations, and you'll see what Ross is talking about. We also have some content out there that just helps kind of orient people to how to interpret the results of MITRE, because it can be a little bit difficult if you're not familiar with it. So be sure to check those out. And then the other one that you mentioned, you said IOCs, just because I'm always a member of the acronym, please, indicator of compromise. And then I would ask you, Ross, maybe kind of deconstruct the components of prevention. We hear a lot about, signatures. We hear about behavioral, prevention. Now we hear about AI. So maybe you can help kind of distinguish the relationship between these different elements that can be used as part of a preventative tool.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like talking about the multiple layers of defense that we have in our products, because there's this very kind of legacy perception that there's antivirus and that equals signatures, and then there's EDR and that just equals kind of behavioral detections but not preventions. But the reality is there's this kind of full gamut of technologies in our products that do a combination of prevention and detection. And at Sophos, because we've got that kind of long storied history of really deeply understanding these threats and having huge databases of threat intelligence that are just kind of churning all the time, we've really been able to dial our products such that Whereas other vendors might have, kind of detective controls in places because they don't have the confidence in the quality of the data. We've managed to kind of dial them up to 11 and actually have a lot more of our components can operate in that prevent mode without having, dumb stuff like blocking 127.0.0.1 or google.com and all the kind of stuff that goes wrong if you try and instrument kind of, detect, a kind of lower quality threat intelligence in a prevention mode. So I'll start kind of, and I'm going to try and do this. Hopefully none of the Sophos Labs guys are watching me because I'm probably going to butcher exactly how this all works, but I'll try my best. So I think the bottom, I think it was a pyramid where you've got this kind of bottom layer, which the atomic IOCs that I talked about. They're very brittle, but they change a lot. But there's a ton of value if you block. If you block really, really regularly. So that's domains, IP addresses are the main ones. The kind of next level up, you've got, I'd call it, it's still atomic IC, but it's maybe when it's hit your disk, so it's a little bit further into your system. You've got the checksum, just the hashes match. It's a known bit of bad malware. There's actually another interesting thing though. We don't just have large databases of hashes of known bad. We actually have huge databases are also known good, and they're actually as important because particularly as you move up the stack, and I'll get to ML in a second, those hashes of known good are actually really, really important. But before I get to that, you've got our exploit prevention technology. This is one of our most advanced and powerful pieces of technology in the whole industry, frankly. I'm going back a long time here, but I'll never. This is very signatureless, so it's very kind of next gen trendy stuff, if you will. I'll never forget the demo that Mark, who runs the team that builds this exploit prevention technology, showed back in when WannaCry came out. He loaded up a copy of Sophos Endpoint. You probably remember this. It was a year out of date. And it turns out that a year out of date, so a year before anyone knew about the Eternal Blue exploit that was used as part of the WannaCry attack, we could block it with this with this behavioral, with this exploit prevention technology. So that does all sorts of really cool stuff by kind of monitoring memory and injecting itself into processes to spot the way that to spot kind of common techniques that malware uses to kind of gain access into systems. So that's a super cool piece of tech. And then if you move up again, we've got our kind of behavioral detections. So behavioral, you could kind of call them signatures, but they're not signatures in terms of like people think signatures, they think, it matches this hash or something. Really, all that work is done much earlier nowadays. The behavioral detections I'm talking about are the types of things that will like a sequence of events on the system, writing this registry key in this way, followed by popping up and then killing another process, shortly after, et cetera, et cetera. That's our kind of behavioral detections layer. And I think this is the way they run. I might have got these slightly out of order. Then you've got our ML engine, of course. So our ML engine, so we're one of the first in industry to use machine learning to identify malicious PEs, so malicious Windows executables, particularly, I think that must have been 2017-ish, I think, or 2016-ish, around that time frame. Really promising new approach in the industry. We were one of the very early adopters of that approach, but it had an Achilles heel, and it still has, to be honest. These ML detections, the fact is they're really quite noisy. They take a lot of they detect a lot of legitimate software as malicious, which brings me back to Sophos. Kind of because we've been around for a long time, we've got a very mature and very well-resourced Sophos Labs function inside of the XOps group. We've got all these known good checksums, and that allows us to actually suppress a lot of the ML false positives, because the ML might say it's malicious, but we've actually got high confidence it's not, because we've got all this understanding of all these this kind of known good. And of course that's not static. Like we have to do a lot of automation to continually update and curate that database of known good. So those are our kind of our endpoint detections, prevention protections. Then on top of that, we have our cloud detections, and this is where we really go from kind of that prevention first approach, which is when we do work on the endpoint, to this more kind of detection, this detection first approach, which is where we do our work in the cloud. And that of course has some advantages because we can bring together signals from from multiple devices, from the network, to give you that kind of more global view of a threat. And that's exactly, if you're talking about Sophos MDR service, they're primarily operating on those cloud detections for the precise reason that threats got that far. That's where you want to be spending your time. And typically those are they're the more advanced threats, right? They're not the simple ones. The simple ones we blocked 5 steps ago, basically.
Yeah, that's a lot of layers. I'm sure the Sophos Labs team will fact check you at some point on any of these to make sure that you had the right ordering. But yeah, the point being, I mean, there's a ton of pieces in place, and I think some of these go a little bit underappreciated again as some of the conversation has gravitated around detection and response and security operations tools. But bringing back around to that SOC efficiency piece. So yeah, I mean, the negative impact is you have prevention tools which aren't as effective. They're either letting things through or they're creating too many, false positives, and it's creating work on the back end. What are some of the metrics that can be used to measure that SOC efficiency piece? Because that also gets back to the cost control, right? If we have poor prevention, we're going to have to hire more people or invest more in agentic AI to do this work on the back end. So maybe talk a little bit about those pieces.
Yeah. So the first thing, the one thing that you never want to do is measure an operations team on volume of tickets, either opened or closed. That's just that's always going to result. It's always going to result in bad outcomes. Basically, the metrics that we do like to use are, so we use mean time to triage. So we want to make sure that when something does get through, that it's picked up quickly. Now that will naturally kind of incentivize having less alerts, because if your mean time to triage pops up, it might be because you're basically bubbling too much stuff up. You're not preventing enough, and your analysts are getting overwhelmed. Mean time to resolution is another one. That one can be kind of a careful one, because if you over focus on that, it can be low for the wrong reasons. It can be low because you're looking at really simple, you're bubbling up really simple threats that aren't a real risk because you're being overly noisy, but managed carefully. Mean time to resolution can be a really really important one. I really like the it's kind of coming back to if you've got an analyst, like a real person spending time on something, you want to make sure that they are really using that kind of human brain and ingenuity to its full, to its full effect. I actually really like metrics around RCAs and how how teams are getting better at preventing, seeing it. I mean, the ideal, I also to my team, the ideal kind of ops setup is almost like you get, one alert every 3 years, and it's a major incident. That's kind of the highest signal to noise ratio. I don't think we're ever going to get there, but we should drive towards that. So that's why as best as you can, and this really requires you to essentially have a lot of time on your hands and not be doing a lot of busy work, is to spend a lot of time on your RCAs, so your root cause analysis, for as many of your incidents as possible, even things that, the NIST definition of an incident, by the way, is tiny. I can't remember exactly, but it's essentially something that causes you to take action to defend yourself, basically. So you can argue that almost anything that comes through as a detection in a well-functioning system is basically an incident. And when you have an incident, you want to say, well, how can we improve our preventative controls to stop that thing bubbling up again? You want your incidents to not be repetitive, to be kind of different things every time, because it shows that you closed off the hole last time, and you want to do as rare as possible. So tracking all that work and ensuring that you're getting better over time, for me is probably the number one kind of way to show that you've got a well functioning system that isn't just focused on tickets and busy work to demonstrate value.
I love that. I mean, that's something that's particularly close to my heart. Having come up in cybersecurity from an MDR kind of centric background as I have. One of the things I think that people don't always appreciate is the amount of work that an MDR operations team or an in-house security operations team spends on the refinement of detection and detection engineering, right? Everyone kind of focuses on, well, tell me about the incident that you stopped and the threat that you removed from the environment, because those are cool. Those are the things that sound cyber ninja and they're fun. But that kind of feedback loop, that system or virtuous cycle of taking what we learned from the incident and applying it back to the front end so that we can prevent that type of thing from occurring or requiring more human effort when it inevitably happens again. Detection engineering thing, absolutely essential for driving up SOC efficiency. So I love that you brought that up as look at it as a system. Don't just look at the individual metrics and their component parts. Look at it as a collective.
I mean, don't get me wrong. We all love kind of hands-on battling the bad guys. It's kind of it's not always fun in the moment, but reflection sometimes, you look back, some of the most fun kind of parts of anyone in operational security's kind of career is always when they're like hands on keyboard battling their adversaries. But you don't want to be doing it all the time. And when you do want to be doing it, you want to be against a worthy adversary. You don't want to be doing it against junk. That's no fun. Just booting kind of junk out your environment that could have been avoided when, on a Friday evening when you want to be at, spending time with your kids or out with your friends or whatever. Yeah, it gets old really, really quickly, which again, I think this is an important thing to understand about these preventative controls. I don't think anyone's, and this is maybe comes back to the genesis of, prevention being seen as a bit legacy maybe. We all realized, probably over 10 years ago now, that prevention isn't the be all and end all. It's not perfect, but that really misses the point. When nobody's calling prevention perfect, a determined attacker will get around preventative controls, but they buy you a ton of time and they save you a ton of effort. And even against the most determined adversary, even some pretty kind of dumb preventative controls, if they get in the way of that attack, if they slow that adversary time down, which gives you time or gives your MDR team time to come in and actually get that hands-on keyboard response to that adversary, that is worth so much. So I love, I think Joe uses it quite a lot, our CEO, the idea of these tools as a shield. A shield that really gives you that defensive advantage versus something that you can just put up and forget about forever.
I was going to bring up Joe's shield terminology around the best shield under kind of persistent attack eventually will break. The point of the shield is to give you time so that you can counter. You don't defeat any enemy with the shield alone. So yeah, I absolutely love that. All right, so we made it pretty far into a webinar, consider the times that we're in, without getting deep into AI. You mentioned AI, you talked about machine learning a little bit, but of course, this is the thing that everyone is talking about is how is AI augmenting prevention? And it's, part of the overall, everything now can be infused with AI, which yields a ton of benefit, but it also creates some confusion among buyers of, what's real here. And you mentioned the various layers of prevention that go into this. Where does AI exist? Is it one of those layers? Is it surrounding all of them? Kind of walk us through, how is AI being used, and how can you as a buyer, as someone who's evaluating products, know what's real versus what is maybe marketing hyperbole?
I got you. I just got to bring this up first before we go there. So we talked about kind of mean time to triage and mean time to detect. I heard a great new metric the other day, which was mean time to AI. So how long do you have a conversation before AI comes up? And we've got quite a high mean time to AI here, which I'm quite impressed at. I don't know if that's good or bad yet, but just observation, because it's usually about 30 seconds. So AI, I mean, look, obviously it has a huge promise across the industry, particularly in security operations, to take away a lot of the kind of drudgery and just busy work that frankly is there's too much of in security operations work. Now that's exciting. I think the reality is we're still figuring it out as an industry how to fully automate that life cycle, and it's going to take quite a long time. A challenge is and I think a lot of people will have kind of maybe experienced this in their day-to-day lives. So LLMs particularly, they're great when you are querying public data that doesn't require any particular amount of context. They're better search engines. They have this great view of the kind of world based on the public data that they've been trained on. Where they struggle a bit more is when they have to incorporate a ton of kind of organizational context. Now, there's approaches like that. Obviously, we had kind of RAG early on, and now we've got kind of the MCP, which is a kind of way of plugging in models to each other so that they can provide context to these models, and they're getting much better. Right now, I think really the true value though for LLMs particularly is about providing that automated context and making the analyst better. I think it's risky to assume that a LLM can make kind of high value, highly consequential decisions in a complicated organization without fully understanding the context and having no human in the loop. I think we're, frankly, quite a long time away from that. I think we're just going to be getting better and better as, it's just going to make humans and SOC analysts better and better for quite some time. There are some exceptions to that. It's not as kind of trendy as LLMs, but with the right, as I referred to earlier, with the right amount of kind of false positive suppression, I think kind of convolutional neural networks, the kind of the machine learning classifiers that we've been using for some time you can trust them to block a lot of threats, at an acceptable FP level, provided you've got the right suppression in place. And that's been a really successful approach that frankly we probably don't talk about enough anymore. I think everyone's kind of over-rotated towards LLMs because that's the really, exciting use case. But we've seen huge advantages in AI and machine learning, over the past kind of 15 years, and LLMs is just kind of one version of that. So that's something that we certainly shouldn't lose sight of either. Overall, I think the key is LLMs are great at making humans better, helping guide them. But the ultimate decision, I think, always needs to be coming from a human. If you just look at an analyst in an organization making a decision about something, there's so much organizational context required. It's what is that person's role? Is this pattern of activity, normal for their role? And often they're actually reaching out to people and, asking them questions and things like that, working very cross-functionally across multiple tools to arrive at that final decision.
So if I'm a buyer, and 99% of organizations have some sort of endpoint prevention tool already installed. It's one of the most ubiquitously used cybersecurity tools out there. But people are continually evaluating them, potentially looking at opportunities to upgrade. So if I'm a buyer and a vendor comes to me and says, I've got AI-powered prevention, and it's it's in their marketing materials, it's in their slide decks, it's on their website, and it probably is for a lot of vendors. what questions do you ask? How would you evaluate that? What do you ask that salesperson? Well, tell me what that means and what that's doing, so that you can start to get to the root of what is the capability here that's actually being proposed.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the question to ask. There's nothing worse than kind of AI being kind of presented as mystique, just magic, magic. All these models, okay, you don't have to understand the kind of the intricacies of how an LLM works or kind of machine learning classifiers or anything like that. They're all plugged into IT environments that most people or everyone on this call will understand. So what are the integrations? How does it how does it plug in? What data is it taking in? What decisions is it operating on when it makes when it makes those decisions? The absolute basics. Are you talking about blocking executables, or are you talking about kind of anomaly detection across multiple data sources? Just basic stuff like that. Then I really like to dive in on how they're measuring efficacy. The vendors that really understand AI have data science teams that have a lot of rigor around the way that they prove that their models work under specific constraints and in certain situations. So, a kind of crude analogy might be like regression testing, kind of test cycles in software, in software development. If you understand software engineering, you're pretty reluctant to buy from a software vendor who hasn't got good test coverage, because they're going to have really big quality problems. The same applies in AI. Data science teams will be able to give you a really good, or companies with good data science teams will give you a really good answer around how they're proving and analyzing the efficacy of their models. That would be where I'd really home in.
Yeah. And I think in most cases that's going to be a follow-up call for a lot of vendors, because I think that frontline salesperson who's been told to kind of AI wash everything and just append it to every statement probably isn't going to be that well equipped to answer some of those questions. But I think that's what you have to do as a buyer right now, is evaluate that, and on both ends, right? Because you mentioned the prevention piece of it, but also in terms of how AI is being used to augment a human analyst's operation workflow. Is it serving up data to them in a way that makes it easier for them to assess the situation and make a decision, versus claims to fully remove the human from the loop. So I think, those should trigger, ask follow-up questions in any time a vendor is positioning some of these things.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've kind of danced around the topic a little bit, and we've even used the term shift left. So Ross, can you kind of give us the origins of this term shift left and how we're applying it here to endpoint security and preventative controls?
Yeah. So I'm obviously responsible as well as security operations internally in protecting Sophos. I obviously spend a lot of my time on product security, application security. It's a really critical part. Obviously, we aim to build very secure products for obvious reasons, to protect you all. And this concept of shift left is very common in application security and engineering circles. It's the basic concept that the earlier you fix a bug in product development life cycles, the less costly it is to make that fix. So the extreme example of that is if it's caught at the IDE phase, so literally the moment the engineer writes the bit of code, if the IDE pops up and spots a little bug, it's often just like an autocorrect type fix. Takes almost no time at all. Then you go through the pipelines, and basically every step gets more expensive. So you might catch it at commit time. The engineer's still written however many hundreds of lines of code before they committed. So now they're having to reload that bit and try and figure it out, but still tolerable. You might catch it in your pipelines, in your testing. Sometimes that means you're going to block a release. That's expensive if you're blocking a release, because it basically means that you've slowed down the entire engineering team, not just the engineer who made the bug. But the real cost comes in if it's in production. There's been a ton of studies done on this, but and I won't try and guess the stats right now. You'll be able to find them online. But we're talking about like orders of magnitude difference in terms of fixing a bug pre-production versus in production, especially if it causes an incident. So shift left has been it's kind of, what's really strange to me. Shift left has been it's an obvious concept, but it's been a very trendy concept over the past couple of years, or the past few years. The terms really gained prominence, and it makes a ton of sense why. But the weird thing is, no one applies it to security operations. It's exactly the same. It's exactly the same concept. The economics behind it are identical, but shift left is super trendy in AppSec, but it's almost not trendy. It's almost the opposite of trendy. Prevention is seen as something that's kind of old school in endpoint security or security operations. There's a very strange dissonance in my head around that, basically.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. How many reports do we see from various vendors, us included, that quantify here's how much it costs to recover from a ransomware attack, or here's the average cost to recover from any number of incidents, and those are all, quantifiable measurements of the cost of not having good prevention or good security operations as a collective. And so, yeah, I mean, that's certainly part of it, is how can we stop more upfront left of that investigation work that needs to be done, or the triage that needs to be done, or the response that needs to be done, prevent those things from working their way downstream, and that's going to make you more efficient. So it is an obvious application of the term shift left, but yeah, I would agree, and this is kind of the premise of where we started this webinar. There is this kind of acceptance that all prevention tools are the same, and that the thing that I should be focusing on as a buyer or an operator or a leader is the detection and response capabilities, because everything now is a DR, right? Endpoint detection and response, identity threat detection and response, managed detection and response, extended detection and response. And so these are the acronyms that have kind of been center stage. But, again, I work with the analyst research community. There's a reason why Gartner still calls its Keystone report the Magic Quadrant for endpoint protection platforms. It's endpoint protection. It includes some of those detection response pieces, but that's an acknowledgement that a lot of this does start with how can you do things at the protection level, at preventative controls first.
Yeah, absolutely. The military use it as well. Actually, you might have heard this term, left of boom. Again, it's exactly the same thing. Let's avoid the explosion, whether it's a real one or a metaphorical one on an endpoint.
All right, so covered a lot, Ross. Kind of closing thoughts. If we kind of go back to the full list of things here that we covered, maybe give the 1 or 2 sentence summary of each of these points, working from top to bottom here. The takeaways that you think people should have as they walk away from this webinar and get back into the thick of things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first two, it's about building up the processes that ensure that you are learning from your prevention failures, essentially, which are your detections, and building out the RCAs to get better. That covers the first two. The hype from reality is, don't be kind of woed and feel outgunned by the salesperson who's making these crazy, complicated sounding AI claims. You understand how this works probably better than you think you do, and just ask the questions to figure out how that AI actually plugs in reality, and that will give you a real ability to kind of sniff out the legit applications from the snake oil. And then finally, don't let's just kind of collectively try and tackle this kind of outdated, weird notion that shifting left is only a concept that works for software development and isn't something that we can apply really successfully to endpoint security and security operations as a major economic, offering major economic value to every company that thinks that way.
Very good. So I do have to ask one more question, because you're a CISO, and because CISOs, and whether you're a CISO or you're an IT leader in charge of cybersecurity or you're a security leader, increasingly you're having these conversations with non-technical stakeholders in the organization, your C-suite, your board. And so if one of our calls to action is, let's kind of orient ourselves as an industry to shift left, how would you have that conversation, Ross, with a board, right? You report to our board. You have these types of conversations. So what guidance or advice would you give to someone who is, going to embrace this concept and start to implement this in their program? How would you talk about this to board or C-suite stakeholders?
I would talk about it in terms of scalability and efficiency. So, most businesses are seeking to grow, and they're trying to grow the top line faster than they're growing their expenses, obviously. But at the same time, so you're always trying to do more with less, right? But at the same time, the threat is also growing. Like, attacks are are just increasing. There's just an ever relentless increase in the volume of attacks. So you've got this double growth, if you will. You're growing and the attacks are growing. So if you're not focusing on preventing earlier, then how on earth are you going to scale your security team? It's just impossible. You've got to get smart. You've got to get better.
Yeah, which gets back to the fundamental, cost, right? The economic case of it is it's about driving efficiencies, reducing risk, and being able to quantify that and use some of the measures that, that Ross talked about, that are based in how much time gets spent on some of this work. That's based on the economic impact of incidents and breaches. So there are certainly a lot of ways to make this real for those stakeholders who are looking for improvements in efficiencies, and ultimately, as you said, do more with less. Be more effective with fewer resources or with a less cost. All right, Ross, thank you so much. Ton of insight from you. Really appreciate it. To everyone who's joined this and listened to this, thank you for taking the time. Ross, how can people reach you if they've got more follow-up questions? How do you want them reaching out?
Yeah, absolutely. LinkedIn is a great way. I'm available on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter as well. You can find me. It's very easy. My name's my handle. So yeah, lots of ways of contacting me.
Very good. Well, yeah, certainly feel free if you want to talk to a CISO. If you've noticed, you probably have noticed, Ross is not your typical CISO. He can talk about things at a very technical level, but he can also talk to things at more like my level, which is really helpful for me and hopefully for some of you as well. So thank you again, much appreciated. And yeah, we will see you all on the next one. But thank you for joining.
Thanks.